Okay, we're recording. Excellent. And nope, I don't have any questions. Okay, so learning objective 4: how and why did the West become a likely place for women's suffrage to become guaranteed? Discuss the specific leaders, organizations, and strategy during the Western campaign of 1893. So look for that in this video, right? You want to jot down specific leaders, specific organizations, specific strategies during this campaign of 1893, this Western campaign. So without further ado, let's go to the, stop share. And then we're gonna go back to share. I need a producer. Okay, video. And I think this is the video here. Yes, all right. So let's watch the West.
If there was any hope at all for women's suffrage, it seemed to be in the West. Here, the idea that women should be dependent on men had given way to the realities of frontier life.
And that's a real important point, right? The women's rights movement could be argued, goes back to the American Revolutionary War. This experience women are going to have with no men around, right? During the war, men were off fighting, right? Every time this happens, a war happens, women come to the realization that, I'm just as capable, despite what the Bible says, what the law says, what customs say, what my father has said to me, taking care of his home, making sure income is coming to this home, making sure the family is sustained, and I can do it in any way that my husband did because I had to. So what is this idea that of these gender roles that are assigned seems to be arbitrary, right? And this is also reinforced with this frontier experience that women are experiencing, right? Even if there is a man out there, and oftentimes they're having to do, out of necessity, all the backbreaking work that a man is doing, building the home, maintaining the home, structure, all of that kind of stuff, farming, just because if you don't, you're going to die. And often, the frontier is a rough place. It wouldn't be uncommon for the husband to die, right? For various reasons. And then a woman truly would be on her own, assuming all of the roles of a man. And right, that would get women to think like, yeah, why don't we have political rights, right? This seems to be arbitrary. Right, we got a woman hunting there. Got women here,
But even in this society where women had greater opportunity, most men continued to resist giving women the vote. In 1893, a progressive governor in Colorado persuaded the state legislature to put women's suffrage on.
And we can pause here. It's good to take notes on this. Davis H. White, this is what they're referring to, leader of the Knights of Labor, right? This is from the labor, if you recall the labor movement, this is one of the first labor unions, a very radical labor union. These were socialists that were opposed to capitalism, right? And understood that part of what capitalism necessitated was creating these gender roles by shrinking the labor force, right? In many ways. So, yeah, this guy right here is definitely a person way ahead of his time and would have been a rare person in government, but nonetheless, yeah, governor of Colorado, David H. White.
Persuaded the state legislature to put women's.
See what it says. Waite issued a proclamation that made women's suffrage the law in the state of Colorado, and Caroline Nicholas Churchill printed it in her newspaper, The Queen Bee, on 1893.
To put women's suffrage on the ballot.
And that's basically the letter of the law right there. which was incredibly controversial, right? This is basically the governor creating an executive order without the state legislature to do that.
Selected to lead the campaign was an influential reporter for the Rocky Mountain News, Alice Meredith. Through her weekly column, Meredith could reach voters all over the state. Years before, she had been inspired by Susan B. Anthony during one of her Western swings. Now, with only 5 months to mount a campaign and absolutely no money, she wrote to Anthony for help.
Dear Miss Anthony, practically speaking, we have, well, next to no money. You ask what we want. First, speakers who can organize and raise money, and next, floods of literature. A word of encouragement from you would go a long way. Yours sincerely, Alice Meredith.
Take note of her.
For 2.5 months, there was no response. Then, 6 weeks before the election, Carrie Chapman Catt, a tough 35-year-old...
Yeah, take note of this person. She will be quite prevalent in the film Iron Jawed Angels. She was provided key leadership through the 1890s and the early 20th century. What you're going to see in that film is Alice Paul, who's going to be the younger women's suffragist during the progressive era. They're going to clash, right? And they don't disagree on the issues, but they disagree on the strategy, right? And we'll talk later about what that strategy is. But definitely one of the most important leaders in the women's suffrage movement and effective leaders in the women's suffrage movement.
From Iowa, and the movement's best organizer, was dispatched to Colorado.
Dear Alice Meredith, I will be in Denver September 5th. Appointments for at least 2 weeks should be completely arranged for. I have a voice like a foghorn and can be heard in out-of-door meetings. Very truly, Carrie Chapman Catt.
When Catt arrived in Denver, the city was in an uproar. The price of silver had dropped. Thousands of unemployed miners roamed the streets.
The Panic of 1893 was a serious economic depression in the United States that began in 1893, similar to the Panic of 1873. This is basically what we would call a recession today. It was marked by the collapse of the railroad overbuilding and a shaky railroad financing, resulting in a series of bank failures. Compounding market overbuilding and the railroad bubble was a run on the gold supply. The Panic of 93 was the worst economic depression in the United States had ever experienced at that time. Kind of put a pin in this and take note. One, this is going to provide kind of an opportunity. People are going to be looking, whenever you have an economic collapse, people are willing to go, okay, well, maybe we really need to rethink everything, right? So that does give women's suffragists an opportunity. But keep this in mind, right? You notice how this is the worst economic disaster to date in 1893. Well, in 1873, the worst economic disaster was in 1873. Prior to that, it was in the late 1840s, right? Each time you have these economic collapses, they get worse and worse and worse until we get to the 1930s. And that is going to be an absolute catastrophe, right? And what's going to be seeing is we're seeing this pattern of these disasters that happen. And the New Deal, the 1930s, the Great Depression, is going to be the answer to going, okay, we cannot just keep doing what we're doing and allow laissez-faire economics, allowing the marketplace to be the sole arbiter of who gets paid, how they get paid, and allowing very few people to accumulate all of the wealth that is produced by industrial capital, while millions and millions and millions of workers are ground out as a result.
Catt and Meredith campaigned in the relief camps, handing out a suffrage leaflet with every bowl of soup.
So that's great. This is great activist work here, right? These people are suffering, they're hurting, and they're giving them charity and going, by the way, don't you think women should have the right to vote? Maybe somebody who's compassionate like me, who is giving you a bowl of soup while you're starving, might be able to get into power one day and fix this mess that men have created thus far, since men are the only ones able to be in power.
People are angry, they're ready for a change. And the women were savvy enough to recognize that if they organized and did their work among the working people, especially, in conjunction with the unions, the labor unions, and the church groups, and the farming organizations, and this could all lead to a groundswell of support for women's right to vote.
While Ellis Meredith was mobilizing women's groups from Denver, Kat set out alone to reach voters in the most remote mining towns and farming communities.
From the bonds of disenfranchisement, qualities of women are to be lost because they stop at a polling booth. To the hard-headed men of Colorado, I state my plea. Make your women as free as you would make your silver free. Never give up till both are free.
One day, to get to a meeting on time, Kat accepted a ride down a mountain on a railroad handcar.
I clung to the wooden platform. My driver informed me that the handcar was liable to jump the track any minute. Somehow I arrived, hatless and breathless, just in time to give my speech. My driver bowed and said, "Just remember, you could not have gotten here if it weren't for a man."
By October, Meredith and Kat had organized 10,000 women. Among the most active were members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU. Horrified by the abuse that women...
So the WCTU was a temperance organization. You'll see this in the Progressive era. This is this goes back to the 1820s. This movement is a movement to outlaw alcohol, and it was led by women for understandable reasons. First and foremost, given that women don't have protection under the law, especially if they're married, right? Spousal abuse is still an issue today. One can only imagine how awful it was back during these times, right? And it's always compounded with alcohol consumption. So women who are involved in this organization, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, are arguing that, you know, if we get rid of alcohol, this will mitigate greatly husbands' abuse against their wives. And the other thing is that since women are denied the ability to go into the professions in many cases at this time, and men are in many cases are the sole breadwinners. If women are working, it's for wages that are pretty low. If men are out spending money on booze, that's taking money away from the family, right? Away from the children's needs. And so this is going to be another impetus to get alcohol illegal. And eventually it's going to this organization that groups like the WCTU marshaled is going to result in banning alcohol during the Progressive era for a good 13 years in the United States of America, for right or wrong.
And children suffered at the hands of drunken men. The WCTU fought for the vote in order to end the sale of alcohol. If woman had the ballot in her hands, one member warned, it would not be many years before the mighty power of the liquor interest would tremble.
Which in turn became definitely a big propaganda tool for anti-suffragists, right? People against women being able to vote, right? If you grant women the right to vote, they're going to take your booze away, your beer, right? And indeed, to some extent, to some degree, they did.
In state after state, the liquor interests had blocked every attempt by the WCTU to gain the vote. Now, when Denver saloon owners realized that women might actually win, they hastily mounted an attack. The liquor dealers plied the unemployed miners with free drinks and plastered the town with anti-suffrage leaflets.
Young man, if you don't want a politician for a wife, but would prefer a good companion, vote against woman suffrage.
On election eve, Meredith and Kat gathered the suffragists together and waited for the Denver returns. By morning, it was clear that Colorado had voted for free silver and woman suffrage. The referendum had passed by 6,000 votes.
I can't believe it's true. It is too good to be true. Oh, how glad I am that at last we have knocked down our first state by the popular vote. Congratulations. Yours, Susan B. Anthony.
Western states continued to lead the way. By 1896, women had won the vote in Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah. Suffragists
Take note of those states, those 4 states, right? By 1896, those represent the first 4 states that guaranteed a woman's right to vote in elections.
across the country dared to believe that the tide had finally turned.
All right, and so we'll leave it at that. There's one more video that I have to substitute a class tomorrow. So if I can't guarantee, but if I have time after I substitute that class tomorrow, which will get out at 2:30, so say maybe 3 o'clock, I might be on to cover learning objective 5. But Tanya, any questions or observations of the 2 learning objectives we just went over? Okay. Excellent. So excellent. Yeah. So yeah. And once you kind of process those notes and give them some thought, if you need clarification on anything you took, definitely reach out on Pronto and seek that clarification. So we'll call it a day here. I'm going to click stop share, and where is the, oh, and recording.
Thank you, Mr.